What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, live with the Awesemo Week 9 Fanduel show. I am here with my partner in crime, Kyle Dvorchak. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. You can follow him at Kyle Tweets here. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you know when this and all other shows go live. Of course, today, the agenda is everything FanDuel, giving you a glimpse of the entire FanDuel slate, how to approach it, where ownership will lie, and just ways to overall attack it. Kyle, what's going on today?
Yeah, not much. We got a little bit injury news popping. We got a really funky showdown slate coming up, so that'll be fun. But right now we are on the FanDuel main slate. Yeah, it is a mess out there.
It really is. And there is some injury news, of course, that we monitor going into the weekend, seemingly every single week. This week, I think it is mainly going to be focused around Christian McCaffrey. We may get some news pop up late in the week, as has tended to happen the last couple of weeks. But with McCaffrey right now, I just want to go with the idea that if he plays, he will probably be a little higher owned than what we have projected right now. And I'm not sure exactly what to make of him, if Mike Davis is going to siphon into his workload or whatnot. But if he's active, should Christian McCaffrey be among the highest owned backs on the slate?
Yeah, he probably deserves to be. It's going to be not like a great spot. It's on the road, underdog, good defense, but there should be a lot of scoring in this game. And McCaffrey doesn't really care about game script. That matters a little less on FanDuel. It is actually a little more concerning that his team doesn't have an awfully high implied team total, because on FanDuel, those receptions don't count nearly as much as his touchdowns do. He scores a lot of them, but if they're not as a team projected to score a lot, his touchdowns could come down. So maybe on FanDuel, he has a little bit of a different calculus. But overall, yeah, he still deserves to be one of the, if not the highest owned player.
For sure. I think McCaffrey, it'll be interesting to see what his ownership comes in at first game back. People may have, forgotten about him a little bit. Recency bias is typically something that affects a lot of DFS players. And we see that with ownership a lot of weeks, like Dalvin Cook projecting for a decent amount of ownership now, not as much on FanDuel, because his price is very high. But, this typically affects a lot of people. Some other injuries we're watching throughout the week. Matthew Stafford, he pops up for the COVID list. He doesn't have COVID himself yet, at least. He still has to test negative a few times. If he does, he can play, it seems. Calvin Ridley looks like more on the doubtful side. Mark Ingram, same deal there. Myles Gaskin ends up on the injury report a couple days ago, and then apparently Matt Breida also dealing with some injuries there. I have no idea who's going to play in this backfield for Miami. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so I saw something. I don't think DeAndre Washington is eligible to play yet. He probably just has to go through like a certain amount of travel-based negative tests. So I don't think he'll play. I could double check that, but I'm pretty sure he won't. Jordan Howard will at this point be active. How much do we see of him? I don't know, probably a decent amount. It could actually be Patrick Laird. He could be the back we see the most of out of this backfield. Could potentially see some Lynn Bowden swing in there, but I do think at this point is just kind of a mess of a committee right now, because they have a bunch of specialists who aren't really good at multiple things. Patrick Laird, mostly a pass catcher. Jordan Howard, great if you need 2 yards per carry, would really bang out 2 yards per carry. And Lynn Bowden, a specialist at everything, but not really a actual running back per se. So probably a lot of split, and to the point where I'm not too interested in.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's most of the large injuries. Kenny Golladay doesn't look like he's going to play, but we'll dive into this and we will get to all of these injuries as we take a position by position look at the entire FanDuel slate. We'll mostly be focused on ownership, starting with chalk, going to some low on leverage, and then potential fades throughout. And this brings us to the quarterback position, generally one we don't see a ton of concentrated ownership on. And it's kind of the same this week. There's 3 different quarterbacks between the ownership percentages of 12.2 and 12.9%, so fairly flat. And then if we just look at quarterbacks owned above 10% on FanDuel, there's 5 of them. I found it pretty interesting that there's some of the most expensive quarterbacks on the slate. We're talking Deshaun Watson, of course, phenomenal matchup against Jacksonville. Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, Russell Wilson's in that tier. So we're talking basically all the expensive quarterbacks. Are you willing to eat some chalk at the position at a pretty hefty salary?
Yeah, the chalk is distributed in. It shouldn't be surprising, but kind of fairly accurately, because Justin Herbert, as the cheapest of kind of the premier quarterbacks, still coming in with top 5 ownership and is in a pretty decent spot versus Las Vegas. I mean, Josh Allen in the spot of all spots versus Seattle. He's also at home. It's going to be fairly highly owned. So I think I'm fine with eating some of this chalk. I would say probably Deshaun Watson is my least favorite of all of them to eat, because that's the game that I think has probably maybe the least shootout potential. You could probably argue the same with Kyler Murray. So I think those are probably the two that, if I'm going with I can't play all the chalk, it's probably Deshaun Watson and Kyler Murray, because I just think the Justin Herbert, the matchup and the overall game script projects to be better there, at least more scoring there. And the same with Josh Allen versus Russell Wilson. That should be an absolute shootout. And although they are incredibly expensive, that has kept their ownership in check. It's not great. You're still getting right now 13% owned Josh Allen, but I think I prefer that to 14+% owned Deshaun Watson.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there are some really interesting spots to target. I think I'm almost more willing on FanDuel to eat some of the chalk at quarterback. The price difference between some of the most expensive signal callers isn't quite as drastic as what we see over on DraftKings. And, generally on FanDuel, we have a little bit more wiggle room to work with our salaries anyway. If we can get Russell Wilson, I just don't see why we're not trying to do that. I mean, the guy's third in completion percentage, fourth in yards per attempt. Seattle is way more pass heavy than we've really ever seen them under Russell Wilson. Right now they're ninth in overall just pass rate. Buffalo's defense has been good, but they're not quite as good as what they were last year. Bottom of the league, at least bottom half in yards per attempt allowed through the air and on the ground. Of course, there's clear stacking options for Russell Wilson in Lockett and Metcalf, which I like. I don't think you run into as many problems on the run back on FanDuel. So if you want to do like Wilson, Lockett, or Metcalf and Stephon Diggs, you're going to have to punt somewhere, but I think it's probably a little more viable on FanDuel than it is on DraftKings. Are you okay with Wilson? Anyone else you're looking at in kind of this expensive but highly owned quarterback tier?
Yeah, Wilson, I agree, expensive, but that expense apparently is keeping his ownership in check. He is right now just inside the top 5. That's perfectly fine for the quarterback who probably, on the context of this slate, has the highest individual upside. Patrick Mahomes probably has the same argument to be made for him, but his game environment does project to be a little more, a little less exciting. Carolina not coming in with a very good probability of winning going into Arrowhead. So the matchup of Russell Wilson versus Josh Allen actually, appears to be more of a back and forth matchup. For that reason, Russell Wilson, of all the super expensive guys, let's say 8,500 plus. So, Kyler, him, and Mahomes is probably my favorite, just because although the price isn't great, FanDuel does give you a little more leniency with that overall larger salary cap. And he's not going to be incredibly highly owned, despite almost certainly having, if not the best, certainly the second best overall upside of any quarterback on the slate.
I agree. One last question that I personally want to ask you is about Justin Herbert and this Chargers offense. First of all, I mean, Justin Herbert, 7,900, I think, is probably too cheap for him on FanDuel. This Chargers offensive environment has been phenomenal. They're not passing at a too high of a rate. They're 25th in pass rate right now, but they're running so many plays that it doesn't necessarily matter. They're running currently 72 plays per game. That's second in the NFL, 8th in plays per game. They've given up 30 points in 3 straight games. What do we make of Herbert? Is he ever going to throw to, some of his regular pass catchers in the end zone?
Yeah, I mean, man, he's thrown touchdowns to, I believe, Virgil Green, definitely Jalen Guyton, maybe Joe Reed. I don't know. Joe Reed even alive. All of these guys, Donald Parham, all of these guys are catching touchdowns. But when you look at who is on the field and who is getting the targets, it is essentially 3 guys. It's a little bit to the running backs, but it is mostly specifically to obviously Keenan Allen, Hunter Henry, and Mike Williams. If they are getting a vast majority of the targets between that 3 trio, I think it would be wildly unsustainable to just dedicate 1+ touchdowns per game, in your projections, to these random guys. Is there a small chance on any given week that these random guys score touchdowns? Yes, but are they doing it at a wildly unsustainable rate? I think the answer is absolutely yes. So I think we're going to see maybe not tempered ownership, but it's the price specifically, the tempered price on the weapons of Justin Herbert, because they haven't scored touchdowns, which is the random part. The predictable part is the targets, which Keenan Allen is seeing a lot of. The deep targets, Mike Williams is seeing a lot of. So I think Justin Herbert as a price play is a great stack. Problem is it is a bit chalky. So maybe if you do it, you look to run it back in a unique way.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Kyle, just for what it's worth, we got an ownership update 6 minutes ago. So be aware when you're looking.
I'm refreshing right now. Thank you.
Yeah, so the run sheet it's mostly the same I'm looking at right now, but 6 minutes ago, right before the show started, we got a little update. With that said, looking at some leverage, I think it's an interesting spot this week just because we don't really have a pure chalk quarterback. We have a couple guys with semi-condensed ownership at the top, but I do think there's a few signal callers in some potential spots here that we can exploit. For example, this Kansas City-Carolina game has a really high total. Of course, that's mainly focused on the Kansas City side. but we're getting Teddy Bridgewater coming in sub 2% or sub 3%. If we want to get a little weirder even yet, I mean, a guy like Lamar Jackson, who is just crazy upside, is 1.2%. He's got a good matchup or a tough matchup going against Indianapolis's defense, but the price has come down on Lamar Jackson. He's only 8,100 on FanDuel. The rushing upside there, I think, is even more important. Are you willing to take a shot on Lamar Jackson?
Yeah, I mean, I updated our ownership projection, thinking, well, maybe my Lamar Jackson play doesn't look as good. Nah, still looking around 1%, man. I get it. Lamar Jackson has certainly not been, and we should not project him to be what he was last year. Both his rushing and his passing numbers have come down, but they're not terrible. He's not playing awful. I believe he has three or four like QB1, top half QB1 games on the entire week, not even the main slate this season. It's just the lows have been much lower. Last year, there were hardly lows. Like, lows weren't in the range of outcomes for Jackson. Now they are again. But we still know there are highs. There are like spiky touchdown weeks. We have multiple, like Mark Andrews, multiple touchdown weeks. So I think Lamar Jackson at 1% ownership should always be like, I'm just going to keep going over the field on this guy because, one, it doesn't take a lot. I'm not, if you're, say, playing like, a 20 set of lineups, you literally have to play him once to get over the field. You play him 2 or 3 times in that set, and you are going like way over the field. So I'm probably just going to continue going back to the Lamar Jackson well. I still believe that at some point, because he has already done it this year, just not to the massive like QB1 overall 30 points on a slate type of deal, he will have 1 or 2 of those games, and I want to capture those games. And the market share numbers are condensed. So when you stack him, you are likely, not guaranteed, but likely getting the right picks, because it's a lot of air yards to Marquise Brown, still like a top 5 or 10 target share to Mark Andrews. So it's not like you're picking from a larger set of guys to stack. So I'm still going back to it, man.
Yeah, I will say all his pass catchers are coming in cheap as well, at least cheaper than we've historically seen them, which we'll get to as we move through the positions. But it's really interesting to look at Lamar Jackson. He's a guy that's 30th in completion percentage and 23rd in yards per attempt, drastically different from what we saw last year. I'm not sure what the issue is. That I think part of it is also they're not running a lot of plays. Like last year, they were 3rd in plays overall. This year, they're 24th and they're 26th in seconds per play. So despite not having, like a lot different with the offense, maybe it's some offensive line continuity. I know they're very banged up on the offensive line. Maybe that has something to do with it. But injuries aside, Lamar Jackson is still Lamar Jackson. I think he's worth a look on the slate. As far as fades, the quarterback position is tough just to downright fade some of these really good signal callers. And then when we start talking about your, Jake Luton's, he's only going to be 3% owned. So if you don't play Jake Luton, can you even really call it a fade? I think the biggest place we can look to maybe get underweight on the field would be some of these expensive quarterbacks. On FanDuel, I'm not sure it's as much of a problem, but like the difference between DraftKings and FanDuel. On DraftKings, I'm probably not going to play a ton of Patrick Mahomes just because the stacks that you make with him are so expensive that they're cost prohibitive to your lineup. Same with Russell Wilson. On FanDuel, they are still cost prohibitive, maybe not to the same extent. Is that a reason you could potentially get away from some Mahomes, maybe a Russell Wilson?
Yeah, that is a reason. But like you said, it's not the same scenario where like you struggle to build a good lineup when you build Patrick Mahomes, Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce. Whereas on FanDuel, you have a little bit more leniency. It's still difficult. It still does force you to make some grievous sacrifices, but it's not quite the same conversation we have on DraftKings. More of what I'm looking for in the conversation of fades on FanDuel is just game environments that I don't like as much. And if we're going to see like Kyler Murray, I get that you could argue his price is viable, but like he's not that much different than 400 more for Russell Wilson. I'd go the 400 more every single time, and you're going to get less ownership on it. So I think Kyler Murray versus the Miami defense, they're good. I don't even care too much about the defensive matchup. More just the total isn't anything special, whereas the total Russell Wilson versus Josh Allen, that has a crazy total. So when I can pay 400 more to get access to what appears to be a vastly better game, I'm just kind of surprised that people are so excited to play Kyler Murray in a game that is good, but it's nothing special.
Yeah, I think so too. I think Miami could have trouble keeping pace in that game. And if so, we've seen Arizona take very run-heavy approaches in certain scenarios, which could be a reason to potentially get away from Kyler Murray. I think the same can be said for Ben Roethlisberger. Not that he's coming in with any sort of significant ownership, but just kind of a parallel in a similar game environment where we do have concerns. But of course, guys, as we talk about ownership and all these tools, you can get access to all the great Awesemo Plus tools and content for nearly every DFS sport out there with an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for $29.95. This includes full access to all the premium content and tools on Awesemo.com, including player projections, ownership projections, our premium Slack channel, and much more. Only looking to play NFL? Then sign up now for a weekly NFL package for just $14.95 or give the NFL Weekly Express Pass a shot for $3.95. Again, we're referencing ownership a lot. I think it is invaluable having access to these ownership projections, seeing where the field is at, and making educated, leveraged decisions with your lineups. It's just so important for DFS in today's day and age where we all have access to solid projections. Now, as we move to the running back position, we do have some significant chalk here. And with the update we just got on ownership, it appears James Robinson is basically going to be on a little mini island by himself. Josh Jacobs is approaching in ownership. They are the two most owned backs on the slate. I think it's mainly a price point play for them. On Fanduel, James Robinson, 7,300. Josh Jacobs, 7,700. That's fairly cheap in the context of the Fanduel pricing structure. Are you interested in either of them?
Yeah, I mean, neither of them are bad plays, like you said. Like, you're getting a very similar role, maybe even more pass catching work to buoy a slightly lower rushing projection from a guy like Josh Jacobs versus Derrick Henry. You're getting way more targets from a guy like James Robinson versus Derrick Henry. And I believe James Robinson still leads the NFL in percentage of backfield carries, even over Derrick Henry. Like last week, we actually saw both Deonta Foreman and Jeremy McNichols get the ball in a game where it's not like they're blowing their opponent out. So I think their volume is why you would look to James Robinson and Josh Jacobs over like the massive price discount going to them from Derrick Henry. The ownership on a lot of these guys, though, is concerning. And I still think there are viable pivots where you can find similar levels of volume. The one that maybe you can't make that argument for it that I think I'm still going to fade is at 5,900. It's very difficult to find. It's very difficult to find David Montgomery level volume at 5,900. That is so cheap. When you look at like our next closest projected players our closest owned players at that same price point are Justin Jackson and Devin Singletary. Both of those are tried and true committee backs, whereas David Montgomery, as terrible as he is, he's getting, I believe he leads the league in routes run since Tariq Cohen went down. He's getting most of the carries. They don't really have any backup running backs they use outside of like Cordell Patterson. So I don't know. I think he's terrible. I think that's probably why you fade him. But at least for him, I think you can argue that there is no other way to spend less than 6,000 and get those kinds of numbers. So that's the argument for him. For Henry, Jacobs, and Robinson, I think they're not maybe like locked in fades, but I don't think you can't find similar volume in just as good of spots for similar prices.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think fading Robinson's okay. I'm okay with his pass catching workload. It's fine, but it's not like we don't have other options. Like James Robinson, how many touchdowns do we think this Jacksonville team is going to score with a backup quarterback against Houston? They're already projected to lose this game by more than a score. I think that's a concern, just to try to poke holes in him a little bit. And to your point on David Montgomery, like props to FanDuel. FanDuel actually made me think about David Montgomery.
I know.
On DraftKings, I'm flat out not playing David Montgomery, but he's at a price on FanDuel where I'm like, are we playing David Montgomery this week? And I think, with Montgomery, the main question you should be asking yourself is, what am I giving up? If I'm rostering David Montgomery in one of my roster spots, that's just one spot you can't dedicate to McCaffrey or Chase Edmonds or whoever the runner may be that you like more than Montgomery. So it's not always just a pure price point. It's the opportunity cost and who you're giving up to roster David Montgomery. And that's, I think, the main argument against him this week. There are players that are in that range that I like a lot that aren't too much more expensive. Like David Johnson and Chase Edmonds aren't direct pivots, but they're cheap enough where I think maybe you could roster David Johnson, Chase Edmonds, and then an expensive back rather than, like two really expensive backs and David Montgomery. Do you prefer that approach?
Yeah, I kind of agree that it is really difficult because David Montgomery's seeing so much work relative to his price. But I do think it's the same argument essentially with James Robinson. How many touchdowns do we expect this team to score? Like, sure, Tennessee's defense isn't very good, but the Chicago offense isn't anything to write home about either. And they're also like an inefficient pass heavy offense. So not only do they not rack up tons of yards, but they don't do it through the ground, which is kind of surprising when you have Nick Foles as your quarterback. But I guess when you have David Montgomery as your running back, what is, your alternative? So it's the James Robinson thing where how many touchdowns can you expect this team, let alone the running back within the team, to score? Probably not a lot. So that's really how you find the outs to specifically a Robinson, but the same argument for Montgomery failing is that for a tournament winning lineup, you probably have to get a touchdown from all of your running backs, unless you just go absolutely berserk in terms of the yardage. Like David Montgomery doesn't seem to have that upside. Touchdowns are what he's going to need to make a living on. And how many Chicago touchdowns are we getting? Probably not a lot. So on the other side, David Johnson, like you said, not a direct pivot, but for about 1,000 more, David Johnson on the favored team in the Houston-Jacksonville game, getting not a dissimilar role to like the James Robinson role. He's just like less exciting. He's been less explosive. He doesn't look as good if you watch the games. I don't really care if he's going to have a similar role in a far better spot than James Robinson. Absolutely a good pivot. The exact same argument for Chase Edmonds. We don't know what we're going to see from Chase Edmonds, but does he have the upside to get just as many targets and carries as James Robinson for a little bit cheaper as a favorite at home? Absolutely. All of these things are true. You can find just as much volume potentially and better game scripts, better game environments outside of James Robinson with guys like James Conner on the expensive end, and then with guys like, Chase Edmonds on a little bit of the cheaper end.
Yeah, man, I love Chase Edmonds this week. He's been seeing a lot of work, even with Kenyon Drake in the lineup. The primary pass catcher here is at least 6 targets in 3 of his last 4 games. He immediately saw 12 touches in the game where Drake went down. The matchup, I mean, we want to talk about the Dolphins defense. They're allowing the 4th most yards per attempt to opposing rushers. Everything sets up for Chase Edmonds to have a solid game here. Watch him fail now in this spot, just like we did with Kenyon Drake earlier this year. But, I do think we see some chalk coming in on some of these guys throughout the week. And if we get McCaffrey, we talked about McCaffrey at the jump here. McCaffrey should rise in ownership right now. Just with the uncertainty on him playing, he is priced very expensive on FanDuel specifically, but his ownership comes in at 5.7. Do you think that rises a lot? He's still kind of cost prohibitive on FanDuel. On DraftKings, I think he's a much better value. On FanDuel, we at least have to debate this.
Yeah. I think maybe that would be the reason that it doesn't rise a ton. Although, what is 5.7%? I would bet the over on that pretty cleanly. It seems just like a low price for an active Christian McCaffrey. And although maybe there are definitely reasons that he could fail, obviously it's not a great matchup. We could still potentially see some Mike Davis. I think as long as we get him active, it looks closer to 10%. I still think he's a considerable play at 10% because his price, while prohibitive, isn't like over 10,000 yet. So I think he's a worthwhile conversation. Do you think we see any Mike Davis upon the Christian McCaffrey return? I kind of lean that it is minimal, maybe more than like Reggie Bonifon last year, but not enough to change much of the calculus on McCaffrey, specifically because Mike Davis was hot to start, but like he basically looked like a washed up old veteran in his final 2 or 3 games, which is what we should have expected all along. They have like obviously the first round draft capital, now like the mega contract invested in McCaffrey, and supposedly he's looked fine in all of his practices. Like he's cutting well, looks fine, and like him returning this week is like nothing more than a formality. Like they say he's kind of a lock to return at this point. So because it sounds like that's the case, I would say that like he's almost completely healthy. He's got like there's no reason for the team not to use him like they did last year, essentially, is my argument.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, he is the premier pass catching back in the NFL, maybe outside of Kamara. But I think those two are clearly 1-2, and I think there's a strong argument for McCaffrey being number 1. So I still do think that even though the pass catching doesn't weigh into the decision making on FanDuel quite as much, of course it's a bonus that he's going to catch you a bunch of passes, and he is the 3 down plus goal line back, and we know this. As we move through the running back position, there's one spot I actually want to get your take on both sides of the game. Some ownership that really struck me. The first is James Conner. Of course, the matchup against Dallas, it sets up amazingly for James Conner, but his ownership is modest. He's not even 15% owned right now, 14.7. I'm certainly comfortable with eating this. And like the premier matchup on the slate, they're 2 touchdown favorites. Dallas's defense has been struggled mainly because of injuries, but struggled nonetheless. And then on the other side, like, what do we do with Zeke at this point? So let's get your take on Conner and then Zeke.
I mean, with Zeke, it's the matchup is pretty awful. He's an underdog. And at this point, like his pass catching role seems a bit questionable right now. Like Tony Pollard's gotten a little more involved. His team has, I believe, we'll have to see what the Jets are up to. Are they on the main slate? I don't even know.
No, they're on the Monday slate. They play the Patriots.
Okay, then for sure, there's no way that any team has a lower implied team total than the last time I saw Dallas was at 14, I believe. That is a very small pie of touchdowns for Zeke to eat from. That like essentially caps him at 2 touchdowns, caps him at 1 if someone else scores a touchdown. So I think maybe like Zeke, if he fails this week, depending on who they play next week, could be worth considering. But given the fact that Vegas says they're going to not only struggle, they're going to be downright destroyed on offense, I don't have a ton of interest in Zeke. If he gets cheaper next week, maybe I consider buying into the bounce back. James Conner, yeah, I'm kind of surprised that he doesn't come in as like a more of the Derrick Henry range, but maybe it's because for 700 more, people are choosing to play Derrick Henry. If that's the case, I don't think he's all that different from Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry in a similarly good spot, but at least like the Pittsburgh matchup, like the Dallas defense is worse. They're both favorites. They both get a lot of work between the tackles. Derrick Henry gets more, obviously, but then James Conner actually has a small pass catching role. So I think James Conner as a massive favorite against a terrible defense. 8,200 is expensive, but it's not incredibly prohibitive. I think sub 15% ownership is certainly worthwhile paying for him as opposed to going like 20 plus on Derrick Henry or even like upwards of 25 on Josh Jacobs, who's like an underdog and he doesn't catch a ton of passes.
Yeah, I think part of the reason Connor doesn't have a ton of ownership might be his price point. There's not really anyone else near him. Like Ezekiel Elliott is the closest in price. People just downright aren't playing Zeke. Josh Jacobs is highly owned, but he's 500 cheaper than James Conner. And then if you want to look just above Conner, I mean, we have Derrick Henry, 700 more. And then above that, we start getting to your Dalvin and McCaffrey range. So I think Connor might just lead you to a contrarian build because not a lot of people are getting an 8K running back, an 8.2K running back. And on the contrarian subject, I mean, outside of the expensive plays we already talked about, where are you looking to get a little different at the running back position? Again, ownership's fairly flat outside of James Robinson, Josh Jacobs, and Derrick Henry. There's a lot of guys between this 10 to 17% ownership range.
Yeah, so I think there's none. I think the FanDuel ownership this week actually looks like somewhat sharp. I guess like Zeke is kind of the one argument you could make if you were just blindly following volume, which is not an unprofitable strategy in some sense. Zeke makes a lot of sense. He's only 8K. He's going to get the bulk of the carries. He could see a lot of targets potentially. I don't think I'm going there. I still think I'm looking at like the around 10% range, and especially if you double up on backs around the 10% range. You've got a home favorite, I believe. They might be favored. The Atlanta Falcons. You've got like Todd Gurley getting number 2 in the NFL, I believe, red zone work, at least in terms of red zone touches.
They're definitely favored.
Denver's all. I guess that Denver did pull off that fun, exciting win that cost me a lot of money because of Mike Williams, but. Yeah, Atlanta at home.
God, don't give me. I live bet that game like 7 times.
Well, that's like like the third in the past like year and a half of the just awful, hilarious Chargers blowing awesome leads.
Sorry, guys. The topic of the show isn't why never to bet the Chargers live 7 times, but sorry. Go ahead, Kyle. It's a
good addendum to put in the show though, is that maybe you shouldn't jam in Chargers as they just like choke away this lead. Yeah, like home favored Todd Gurley getting all of the red zone work. Has multi-touchdown upside, and that is like particularly valuable on FanDuel. So he's a spot that I don't think people are going to want to go to because he's not like good per se. His like efficiency metrics aren't great. I don't care if he's 6,900 for a home favorite, like entirety of the red zone work on a decently scoring offense. Yeah, I think he's fine. Justin Jackson, 5,900 is cheap. Man, he is really good leverage off of David Montgomery too. He's good leverage off of his compatriots in the Chargers team because they're going to be popular. I don't love him as much on FanDuel as I love him on a like individual play basis on DraftKings because some of the value I get from him is the fact that he has 17 targets in the past 3 games, 5 targets, I believe, at least 5 in each of the past 3 games as well. That doesn't do me as much good as it does on DraftKings, but because he's perfect leverage off David Montgomery, he's only going to be around 12% owned. I think like a double mid-owned running back strategy could pay a lot of dividends. Antonio Gibson, just another one. Home favored running back, getting at least the last time we saw him, 20 carries in a blowout win over Dallas, I believe. I mean, they should have their way with the Giants, or they should at least be able to beat this team. They are favored. So Antonio Gibson now maybe sealing off the bulk of the work from this backfield. There are a lot of good spots in running backs that we kind of just don't love. Is like Antonio Gibson home favored that much worse than Josh Jacobs road dog? I don't think so, but the ownership says like Josh Jacobs has twice the chance of outscoring him. I think I'm just going to be playing a lot of the 10% plays and fading anything, not downright going 0 on, but probably being very below the field on anything above 20%. So our big 4, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, it's interesting that like the guys in the big 4, 3 of the 4 of them are underdogs. And some of them don't even have a lot of pass catching upside in Derrick Henry and Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry being the lone back in that group that is not an underdog. Now, before we move on, guys, hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy the content. It is the best way to support Kyle, myself, and the entire Awesemo team. And if you've done that already, thank you very much. We appreciate all of you who stop by and watch all of our shows. Thank you. Thank you. We also have some free stuff for you. A lot of times in these island games, if you head over to the Twitter account, check out the pinned tweet. on Awesemo_com, we do a lot of these little giveaways. And tonight, for Thursday Night Football, you can win a year of Awesemo Plus NFL. Just follow the instructions on the graphic. You have to predict whether Aaron Rodgers or Nick Mullins will throw more yards tonight. One random winner will be selected among the correct guesses. Be sure to check out our giveaway on Awesemo_com Instagram handle as well to win a free month of Awesemo Plus Platinum. Again, all you have to do is follow the instructions, pick who throws more yards between Rodgers and Mullins, and there you go, your chance to win. So check that out. Always free stuff over at Awesemo.com. As we head to the wide receiver position, Kyle, an interesting topic of discussion on Fanduel, similar to the running back position. We have 4 wide receivers coming in north of 20% ownership, and then it plummets after that. So with the most recent update, it's just 4 guys above 20%. They are Keenan Allen, Tyler Lockett, Julio Jones, and Stephon Diggs. I don't have a lot of strong arguments against these receivers outside of maybe price. Julio Jones, 8.2K, Allen and Lockett are 7.5 and 7.4 respectively. We talked about a lot of the quarterbacks, and I think you like most of these guys. Is there one you feel particularly strong about?
Yeah, there's not really one that I feel the strongest about. It would probably be Tyler Lockett because, as I said, the Russell Wilson ownership is kind of a little puzzling to me that he's not coming in as like a top 3 owned quarterback. Like it's kind of, he should be taking Kyler Murray's place in my opinion. So I think for that reason, I'll probably have a decent amount of Tyler Lockett despite the chalk because I know my quarterback is going to be a little less popular. So I'm not getting like unowned Russell Wilson, but he's going to be a little less popular. I was thinking that I think the Kansas City game is a good game to at least look into one-offs. I don't know if you need to go so cheap at quarterback to get like Teddy Bridgewater, and the touchdown importance on Fanduel, like the emphasis on touchdowns, makes me a little hesitant to fully stack them. DJ Moore is still priced ahead of Robbie Anderson. Come on, Fanduel, do better.
I mean, we let them work slowly. We got a hyper efficient David Montgomery price. They're getting there slowly with the Panthers.
The David Montgomery price is very efficient because it's very puzzling. Like, man, he's so bad, but it's such a good price. Yeah, I think if I'm looking to, I guess like we're talking about a not dissimilar price range when we talk about 400 more for Tyler Lockett, DJ Moore. I know it's not chalk, but it's in the same price range. DJ Moore, certainly not the number 1 receiver, but I don't even know if you could call him the number 2. He's still leading the team in air yards, and his price discrepancy over Robbie Anderson, although is bad, is going to keep his ownership in check. So not quite on pivots yet, but when we look at the high price guys, I think Tyler Lockett is my favorite of the high priced, high owned. Of the high priced, low owned, DJ Moore maybe kind of fits that same bill.
Yeah, I think you're right. The price on DJ Moore is curious for sure. I think for me, among the high-priced wide receivers, I'm still interested in this Seattle game. Now, similar to DraftKings, we have DK Metcalf coming in more expensive than Tyler Lockett. I think there is some merit to getting up to Metcalf if you have the salary. These two guys, I mean, the target share is so narrow between them both that you can really target either one on a weekly basis. And you're going to have one of them, maybe even both, go up for a blow-up game. We've seen it 2 weeks ago, Tyler Lockett, 20 targets. Last week, DK Metcalf, 15 targets. Both of their target shares are north of 24%. They're both fantastic plays. Generally, I'm siding with the one that's lower owned. It's an interesting proposition on FanDuel this week because DK Metcalf is lower owned, but you have to pay $700 more to get him. Do you have a preference between Lockett and Metcalf?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I think I'll probably have a lot of both because I think Russell Wilson is one of the better quarterback plays. I guess in terms of my position versus the field, I actually would prefer DK Metcalf. The price is difficult to palate when you know that you're also paying like an incredible price on Russell Wilson. But the amount of different that gets me, I'm fine with eating some of like the cheaper chalky plays, like potentially at running back. I think you can go with the boilerplate, cheap, easy plays. You know, you could go with the David Montgomery in those lineups if you're willing to stomach it, you know? So I think in terms of what leverage it gets you, DK Metcalf, probably a better play. If you're just looking at building like the optimal pricing lineup though, Tyler Lockett for $700 cheaper does seem like he'll get just as many targets. I will say, though, DK Metcalf's price over Lockett is probably warranted because the target share is close, the air yard share is not. They get similar targets, but one of them, DK Metcalf, moves down the field and gets the chains moving on every single play. Tyler Lockett, more underneath. He's not like this no air yards guy. It's just that DK Metcalf stretches the field on every other play. So Metcalf probably deserves to be priced a little higher as of right now. The 700 discrepancy is a lot, but you get it back in the ownership. So I think both of them are in play. My position versus the field is a slight lean towards Metcalf, very slight though.
Are you willing to get away from them both and maybe play some Stephon Diggs on the other side? You get a little bit less ownership compared to Lockett. The target share is 29%, and he's just been a straight alpha in Buffalo.
Yeah, he's been absolutely dominant. It's like every game, even I think it was the last game, they threw like 20 or so pass attempts or something, and he still got to like 80 or so yards because his market share numbers just necessitate that no matter what Buffalo does, he gets involved in the offense. I definitely think in that same game, like Stephon Diggs is obviously the guy you're running it back with. It's interesting. We do actually have we have a pulse on John Brown and Cole Beasley in terms of our ownership. Those would be the guys that you would run it back with if you're trying to save salary, but you're not getting like awfully unique. I would say John Brown may be the more interesting one because although like I love Stephon Diggs, it becomes increasingly difficult when you stack DK Metcalf, Stephon Diggs, and Russell Wilson. I think potentially the interesting move would be to run it back with a John Brown, who is the lowest owned of the trio of receivers in Buffalo. And if this game is going to absolutely shoot out, you could see 40 plus pass attempts from Josh Allen. John Brown, although not going to see a crazy market share of those, if he sees enough of them and they go deep, I think he would be a contrarian way to both save money and get your Russell Wilson stacks different.
I think so too. I'm interested in John Brown. I wish I just knew for certain that he was healthy, and I don't feel great about it. But
you'll never know that.
It's true. We will never know that, and I will continue to play him and ideally not lose money. So hopefully, John Brown, you're healthy. If you're not, just sit out so we have some clarity. Now, you talked a lot about the chalk. I think we like it a good amount, but again, in some of these spots, it's difficult to stack. And of course, in DFS, we're always looking to stack our quarterbacks with the pass catchers. So if we're getting different, maybe we can tie this into stacks overall. Where are some receivers you're willing to take a stab on and get over the field?
All right, so I'm looking down at our ownership, and I think I don't know if you'll like this one. I think is quite interesting. Corey Davis would be ideal leverage off of a guy like Derrick Henry, who I think, although is in a good spot, is always a fragile play. The receptions don't matter, end up mattering as much on Fanduel. They certainly, you don't not want your guy to catch passes. And Corey Davis has played, I believe, now 3 or 4 games with AJ Brown in the lineup. I believe it's 3. He's out targeted and out air yarded him in all 3 of those games. I'm not saying he's the number 1 receiver, but I'm saying, can we be so incredibly confident that Corey Davis is not a 1B? Because he's played, the volume has showed that when him and Brown are on the field, he has played as the 1A. And I'm not saying that's his role, but we shouldn't be so confident to pass up a great leverage play like Corey Davis. Mike Williams at basically the same price range, 6,200, I believe leads the league in deep targets. And Justin Herbert, quite good at throwing a deep ball. He's just quite good at everything, it appears. So I think he gives you great leverage off of Keenan Allen as well. Outside of that, any interest in Henry Ruggs? I know we talked about, maybe playing some of these Chargers stacks, or you could just run it as one-offs with, Mike Williams and Henry Ruggs just trading off deep passes or deep receptions. 5,700, maybe a little expensive for a guy who could only end up seeing 3 or 4 targets. But they are quite deep targets. Do you have any interest in Henry Ruggs? I kind of like.
Yeah, so here's the thing with these Charger stacks. 1, I want to play them. 2, who do you run it back with on the other side? I mean, very popular lineup construction that has a high chance of winning is stacking either 1 or 2 pass catchers and having a run back on the other side. So when we're stacking the Los Angeles Chargers, we want to look at some Raiders players. The problem is it's Darren Waller, and then who else is getting the ball consistently? There's no one. Nelson Aguilar pops up for a 9-target game, and then he goes back to dust. Henry Ruggs has run a route on a majority of the dropbacks, but it hasn't exactly led to volume. So it leads to a precarious situation on the other side. None of these guys are expensive outside of Waller. So I think with Henry Ruggs being on the field as often as he is, in the event that LA gets up to a big lead and Justin Herbert's the quarterback I'm stacking, I am willing to take a stab on Ruggs just because he's cheap volume, cheap access to this offense, and a lot of routes on the field. I definitely like that play. I mean, as we're talking about these cheap receivers, and you brought up Mike Williams, you brought up Corey Davis, the direct parallel I have with, Corey Davis, someone in that price range, is why not just play someone like Brandon Cooks, who is someone I'm taking a heavy look at. We see David Johnson coming with a lot of ownership today. Will Fuller's coming in with higher ownership than Brandon Cooks. Cooks is at 10% himself, so it's not like he's low owned, but are you willing to take a stab on someone like this?
Yeah, I don't hate Brandon Cooks. My only problem is that I'm typically looking for correlation. Even when I just play a receiver as a one-off quote, as a non-quarterback stacked receiver, I'm typically looking to run it back with someone on the other side. And I'm not sure who I'd run it back with in Jacksonville. I don't I wouldn't love eating 10% Cooks with one of the most popular running backs on the slate. I don't think you gain a ton of leverage by doing that, if much, if any, really. So I'm not sure what that's just not, doesn't really fit into the way that I'm building lineups. I don't hate Brandon Cooks, but I would probably limit most of my usage of him to specifically Deshaun Watson stacks, which I don't think I'll have a ton of. I have one that I'll throw your way that kind of, I don't know, it's weird. We have Adam Thielen as projected as less than 1% owned. And right now, am I even sure he is the number one receiver on his own team? I don't know, man. Justin Jefferson playing incredibly well. But when I think that's just like, if you're going to get a player who we have a strong track record as being a good fantasy producer at less than 1% owned in the same price range as like 26% owned Keenan Allen, 25 Tyler Lockett, over 20 Julio, over 20 Diggs. I think that's a really incredible leverage play, even if a simple projection would not like him understandably.
Well, what about this? Justin Jefferson's also sub 1%.
Oh, well, let's just do that. Never mind.
Oh, I mean, we can do either.
Do either. Actually, yeah, man. We're stacking Kirk Cousins again, aren't we?
Okay, so there's a big thing we need to watch with this game. I think the game is far more viable to stack if Stafford plays.
Yeah.
If we've Chase Daniel at the helm, I do not think I'll be stacking Minnesota. If they have Chase Daniel at the helm, I think we go back to Dalvin Cook, who we actually didn't mention much, but Dalvin Cook, I mean, what is there to mention? He's a phenomenal play with middling ownership. You just play Dalvin Cook in those environments. As far as the competitive game environment we could see with Stafford, with these sub 1% plays, I love Justin Jefferson. I love Adam Thielen. If you're stacking that game, I think they make a lot of sense as leverage plays. Plus, on the other side for Detroit, I mean, we're not dealing with expensive pass catchers.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I do think, and I've talked to some people who have a strong lean that Stafford will play. Basically what happened is he had a high risk close contact or whatever the terminology of it is, but did not, as of right now, I believe, test positive. So as long as he logs a full week of negative tests, I believe 5 days is the actual number, 5 days of negative tests, which he will be, I assume he'll be like alone in quarantine, and he will even fly out alone, like on a private jet. As long as he logs all those negative tests, he will play. He won't practice all this week, but I mean, what? He's like a 10-year veteran or whatever. I don't really think like 1 week of not practicing, like the Titans, although they probably totally didn't practice for like weeks on end and still looked fine when they came out and killed Buffalo. So 1 week of not practice. Yeah, like well, it was the first week they didn't, and then they practiced the second week or whatever, right?
Illegally.
Well, yeah, they didn't practice, yeah. But yeah, I don't think 1 week of Stafford not practicing should we're not going to downgrade his yards per attempt or whatever. I think he'll probably be fine. So this actually looks like a game environment that, if we're getting all of these, we're double stacking Kirk Cousins, and I think you probably run it back with Marvin Jones, TJ Hawkinson also available. We're Kirk Cousinsing it again, aren't we?
I mean, I did it last week and it cost me a lot of money. Luckily, I was just heavy on that game. So those lineups were completely dead, but I had a lot of other lineups with Dalvin Cook. I was just trying to stack the Green Bay Minnesota game. Minnesota's defense is so bad that sometimes it's an avenue to shootouts just because they can't stop anybody. So even though they want to run, they're not always able to. In this particular game, they're favored over the Detroit Lions. That doesn't mean Detroit's not going to get the opening kickoff and score. They very well could do that. And then Minnesota's in this pass first game approach. But I think it does lend itself more to a Dalvin Cook game, making your Kirk Cousins stacks more contrarian, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's the ideal spot. Of course, I don't know what we see from Detroit. They could very well, not be able to put up points on the board. And then at that point, it's all Dalvin Cook. But like you said, we shouldn't just be so incredibly confident that there's no way this team, that although they ran the ball a lot last week, we just don't know that that's what's going to happen this week. Ownership on Justin Jefferson, on Adam Thielen, and I didn't even look at Kirk Cousins. I would assume his ownership is also next to zero. Their ownership says... Their ownership is telling me that the public believes there is no way in the universe that this team passes a ton. We know that that's not true. We know that anything can happen. I think they're incredible leverage.
I think so too. Guys, before we move on to tight end, I want to tell you about some more free stuff at Awesemo.com. We just have so much right now. For free content today, we have NFL Showdown projections. This is a must today. The 49ers entire team seemingly is injured or has COVID. So take a look at who Alex Baker is projecting to see the volume. It's going to be very important. We also have NFL Week 9 rankings, MMA Top Fighters tool. That's all free today. Also, if you guys haven't done this yet, check out the Odd Shopper tool. I think the single best betting tool on the market. This tool literally is free to the public. You go in there, it shows you totals, lines, player props, everything you can imagine from a variety of bookmakers. That allows you to get the best price, which is extremely important, and it saves you a ton of time instead of just searching around all these books yourself. Head over to Awesemo Odd Shopper to browse a number of the top books, find the right bet for you. It's oddshopper.awesemo.com. You can also track your bets there. You can set alerts so when lines hit a certain price, it'll tell you, and then you can bet it at that price. More importantly, it's free. You can do all this for free. One of my favorite tools on the market. I love it, absolutely love it for player props. So go over there, check it out. Again, that's the Odd Shopper tool at Awesemo. Looking at tight end. This is, I think, the chalkiest position on the entire slate. Darren Waller is sitting alone, 23%. Next is Travis Kelce at 16.9. It's a decent ownership on Kelce, but the reason I think we're getting this big discrepancy on Fanduel, Darren Waller's 6,400, but Kelce's 8K. You got to pay a premium for Kelce. Are you willing to do it?
Yeah, this Kelce price is quite difficult to palate. I think the only scenario I do it is in like very specific, like not even game stacks, but just some sort of stack with Carolina players, because you do need this game to score a lot of points. That's just, you probably need like a touchdown and well over 100 yards, and there are just potential alternatives. I think the pricing on FanDuel at tight end specifically makes it so that, like, you know, like I love TJ Hawkinson, but TJ Hawkinson at 6,000, like, am I really going 400 less, like 400 more and I can play Darren Waller, 1,600 less from Travis Kelce and I can play Darren Waller? You know, Noah Fant seeing a decent amount of work for a reasonable price. I think Kelce is okay, but you do have to assume that this game scores a lot of points, in which case I'm probably stacking it. So I think Kelce is fine, but you do have to play him with correlation. I wouldn't run Kelce alone.
This is really interesting pricing from FanDuel. I think another pricing efficient part of the slate. Normally on FanDuel, I'm just trying to pay all the way up because we don't have the same pricing difference between the minimum guys on FanDuel and the high price guys in that upper tier. This week, it's just Kelce alone at 8K, which actually is kind of leading me into the middle price range for a lot of my builds, which is not something that typically happens for me. Darren Waller, 6,400. It's palatable. You have to eat the ownership, but you can certainly get there. Hunter Henry has a very healthy target share in this offense. I don't know what the guy has to do to get a touchdown thrown his way. He only has 1 of 4 potential tight end touchdowns this year, but he's on the field the majority of the time, and he's very active in the pass game. If you want to look in that same price range, Noah Fant has been heavily targeted by Denver. A lot of these guys in this middling price range make sense. Is this kind of where you find yourself building?
Yeah, usually at FanDuel, we look at like sort of the mid-high price range. We look at our, like the opportunity cost is not that great to go to Kelce on a normal slate. This doesn't appear to be that. We actually do have that price is so difficult to get to in the context of having a lot of good plays on the slate. Like I want to play Russell Wilson. I want to stack him. I can't afford Travis Kelce in those lineups. So I actually think out of all of FanDuel slates this year, this might be the one that I'm most comfortable going to these mid and low price point guys. I agree. Hunter Henry, I think once you dip off of Darren Waller and Travis Kelce, maybe not getting like outright contrarian, but you've moved off of what I would call the chalk. Maybe you could group Hunter Henry in there, but he's still roughly 4% less owned, 3.5% less owned than Kelce. So I think Hunter Henry makes a lot of sense in your Justin Herbert stacks. I think he'd be an interesting, if you want to play this game with one-offs, you could play him with potentially Ruggs. Moving down, like this is the easiest fade ever. We have Mike Gesicki at, 6% owned. I'm going to go 0 on him. He's given up work to like Durham Smythe and Adam Shaheen. His offense didn't look good last week. I will fat pass on that. Hayden Hurst, kind of interesting, fills that sort of Hunter Henry role, not like a, alpha number 1 tight end like Darren Waller or Travis Kelce, but he gets a lot of at least decent market share on a team that for Atlanta is going to throw at one of the highest rates in the entire league. Because they're, it's either that or run it with Todd Gurley. So they throw the ball a lot. They're going to be without Calvin Ridley. Hayden Hurst, I believe, got actually like a significant target share over Russell Gage last week when they had mostly no Calvin Ridley in that game. I think Hayden Hurst in the mid-range is probably one of the solid plays, and you can actually you could correlate him with a Jerry Jeudy or something. Go for it.
I think you could too. I don't hate playing Denver pass catchers. We talked about this last week. It's a good game environment. The total's around 50 points. Denver is going to have to throw. They probably aren't going to be efficient, but we're getting a condensed target share. A lot of it going to Jeudy, a lot of it going to Fant. We already touched on him, but I like Fant quite a bit. One guy I've been very down on all year, but the ownership is starting to creep lower and lower. The price is creeping lower and lower. Do I play Jonnu Smith finally?
Dude, I think I played Jonnu. I mean, I know I played Jonnu Smith last week. You can play Jonnu Smith when the price comes down and when the ownership comes down and when he has leverage off of a chalky Derrick Henry. Like, all he needs to do is score 2 red zone touchdowns, which if there's any way for him to, like, if there's an avenue for him to get fantasy points, it's with red zone touchdowns. He's not this crazy, like, market share numbers guy. He's not going to get 12, 13 targets, but he could get some looks in the end zone. So if he scores 2 touchdowns, you are just destroying those Derrick Henry lineups, assumedly. So he's good leverage. He's in a price point where, like, if I'm moving off of the chalk, I am necessarily moving down to cheap guys. So I think Jonnu Smith is a perfectly fine play.
I think he is too. The punt discussion on FanDuel is kind of difficult. We're already in this lower price tier range. And once we get below 5K, there's not a lot of guys I'm interested in. I think some people will be trying to punt the tight end position. A few names that are going to be on the field a decent amount. Irv Smith is really game plan specific. He plays more when Minnesota is down. When they go run heavy, he comes off the field. So when you play him, you just hope Minnesota's trailing. There's Ian Thomas on the field a lot, essentially a 0 in the pass game. I mean, if we want to get up to the Houston tight end, I think Jordan Akins could take the field this week. He's 4,800 and fits the mold as your pure punt. Is there anyone down here you're looking at?
Yeah, I don't like, it's not a great spot to punt. Like, here's a perfect example, like Albert Akuibunam. I like Albert Akuibunam. Whenever he's on DraftKings, I actually consider playing him. For what is this? He's 5,000. For 600 more, you can get Hunter Henry. For the same price, you can get Logan Thomas. For 600 more, you can get Hayden Hurst. These are all far better plays. Like, for 1,400 more, you can get Darren Waller. I would never consider playing him. I just don't see it happening. Whereas Irv Smith, actually cheaper, surprisingly, is 4,600. And like you said, he's only game script dependent. In a universe in which they run, like, they pass 20 times, he probably gets 2 targets. Last week, that's exactly what happened. They passed, I believe, 16 times, and he got 1 target. He was still in the field for 75% of the snaps. That was in line with his previous 2 game totals, in which he got 5 and 5 targets. They just didn't have to throw a lot. So, like everyone on Minnesota, if they are going to have a lead, at least the pass catchers in Minnesota, if they're going to have a lead, you're probably drawing that. But if it is a competitive or like underdog Minnesota type game, that's when these Kirk Cousins stacks are going to hit. And I think Irv Smith makes sense in the context of those. I don't play him probably in any lineup that doesn't feature Kirk Cousins, but he does open me up to just another way to build a unique roster if I stack him. So I think he's in play. And I like the Jordan Akins call too, as long as he plays, which I do believe he returned to practice earlier in the week from both an ankle injury and a concussion. As long as he plays, he was the primary pass-catching tight end in the early part of the season, should resume that role again. Darren Fells stepped into that role and performed well, but he's essentially a blocker. He's like 6'7" and a giant. He's like a guard, basically. So I think he returns to the blocking role, and Jordan Akins is a viable punt play, but I'm more looking in the mid-range.
Yeah, I think so too. Tight end, I think, is pretty cut and dry. Kelsey is very cost prohibitive. He's going to be tough to reach. Waller will be the chalk because he's really the only alpha on the slate who has a modest price. And then that mid 5K range is going to be popular but spread. So you won't have singular ownership on one guy in a really concentrated position. As we close out the show here, Kyle, and we talk about bold calls usually at the end of these shows, I want to talk about it in regards to stacks, because I think stacking will be very important on this FanDuel slate, especially with the expensive stacks we're seeing at the top range. Because of the expensive Pat Mahomes, the expensive Watson and Russell Wilson, and you name those quarterbacks, I think getting a little different with some of the cheaper quarterbacks, but still good game environments, can be one way to approach this. So Matthew Stafford is someone I'm looking at. I know the coronavirus situation is clouding the situation, but if Matthew Stafford is active, and previously, before we got news about the quarantine that Stafford has to undergo now, Minnesota and Detroit had a 52-point total. Matthew Stafford's the slight underdog in this situation, leaning towards the pass. Marvin Jones is a very cheap stacking option. There's very clear run backs on the other side for Minnesota. You take your pick. Do you want to use Dalvin Cook in a run heavy approach from Minnesota? Do you think Detroit gets up early via Matthew Stafford to Marvin Jones and Hawkinson, and then we have to use Justin Jefferson on the other side? There's a lot of fun ways to stack a game that had previously been totaled at 52 points, which is one way I think we can get very contrarian here. Is there maybe a contrarian stack that you like?
Well, you basically stole the other half of it, but I have the other side of the game. I think we both just think that this game is one where, as long, barring any crazy situation, which we kind of already have, barring any changes in the crazy situation, which we believe is under control and Stafford will play, could change, stay up to date on that. We got a lot of great Sunday content popping here on Sunday morning. You'll be on that. We have some other, like Alex will be on it. So check us out then. I'm sure you'll find out if Stafford is playing. It seems like a conversation we might need to have. Assuming he is playing, the total was really good. It's not that dissimilar from other popular spots, but people just don't want to play Stafford. They don't want to play, and maybe rightfully so, Kirk Cousins, because Dalvin Cook is supposed to get a lot of the work. We don't know. One, we do know the game is supposed to score a lot of points. We don't know for sure that Dalvin Cook will come out and get 30 carries and go for 150 yards again. If it ends up being one or two long bombs from Kirk Cousins, that's it. That's the millie. So I'm going to say a double stack of both Justin Jefferson, Adams, Thielen. And I like running it back with TJ Hawkinson. His price is kind of egregious, honestly, because he's in the same price range as Darren Waller. But if he scores 2 touchdowns, that price doesn't matter. He could be 7K and it wouldn't matter. So you're betting on the high end of outcomes, killing his bad price. You know, it won't matter. So that's where I'm going. Double stack Kirk Cousins. You run it back with Hawkinson and you make yourself a lot of money.
Yeah, before we head out of here, one other thing I want to say in overall ownership. Outside of this, like Buffalo-Seattle game, I think we can take some chalk in certain lineups. Like, let's use Julio Jones as an example. Say we want to eat the Julio Jones chalk. We want to stack him with Matt Ryan because, of course, we want to stack our primary pass catcher and the primary quarterback. Well, does anybody want to play Denver? I don't think they do. So immediately you throw in Noah Fant, you throw in a Jerry Jeudy, and then your whole lineup is contrarian, even though you have a Julio Jones in your lineup. I mean, you could do a double stack, Matt Ryan to Julio Jones, Hayden Hurst, run it back with Fant on the, not, if you use Hurst, you can't use Fant. So let's say you use Jeudy in that situation. And I think you have a fairly contrarian lineup. Do you think that's viable?
Yeah, I saw that. And I don't even like Kyler Murray this week, like I was saying, but we had like 3% ownership on Christian Kirk. And even like out of all the stud receivers, we had fairly low ownership on DeAndre Hopkins. So like you should normally playing a single, like a non-stack quarterback, like I guess it's a slightly more viable on Fanduel, I think, but normally that is a very bad idea. Doing that with Kyler Murray would be awful this week because you can actually get unique Kyler Murray builds because despite his popularity, people apparently want to play him as a one-off. So you can actually go to your, Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, and Christian Kirk, and you'll have a massively unique way to get the second most popular quarterback on the slate.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, I don't hate running back Dolphins players.
Sure.
I mean, Tua had a terrible game, but that game script lined up for them to really not have to use him. They had a couple special teams plays that really went their way. So the Dolphins got some easy touchdowns without having to do much. Like Tua was in his first game in a tough matchup against the Rams. He now gets Arizona. It's not easy, but it's at least a little bit, I think, looser than the previous matchup. So Devontae Parker, Preston Williams, probably not Gesicki, but those are some decent run backs on the other side.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if you're looking to play the chalky plays, there are almost always ways to get different by playing the chalk. And it's just that people are kind of, I don't know if they're afraid or they just don't think Christian Kirk is a good player or whatever, but that is how you play chalk, is you correlate it with like low-owned non-chalk. And there are almost always ways to do that. I think people just aren't looking hard enough.
Yeah, I agree. That'll do it for us, guys. Hit that thumbs up button before we head out. Subscribe to the channel. There's a bunch of shows on every single day. We have another one yet today coming up tonight. It is live before lock, and this is one we can't miss. It is the Green Bay Packers taking on the San Francisco 49ers, and there is seemingly an endless amount of injury news that we are still waiting on tonight. Our very own Kyle Dvorchak will be breaking it down for you guys. Kyle, what time are you on tonight?
We're on at an hour before lock, so 7:15 or 7:20. I always get them confused, right around there.
Perfect, guys. And of course, Podcast Network, check us out there if you don't want to watch on YouTube. Otherwise, I am your host, Matt Gajewski, on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. He is Kyle Dvorchak at Kyle Tweets here. We'll be back again, same time, same place next week, and good luck.